people that are contributing locally and nationally and even internationally to important environmental issues and important climate issues. And one of them is our next speaker, Deborah Cramer, who lives in West Gloucester. She recently wrote a book called The Narrow Edge. It's a fascinating read about a bird and its migration and its dependence on ecosystems. And so when we were thinking about who could talk authentically from Gloucester about how climate change could impact nature, which we depend on. Sometimes we like to think we don't depend on nature, but actually it's really the source of our economy and of society. We've seen where nature collapses, societies collapse, and economies collapse. So thinking about how climate change could impact nature, we've asked Deborah to talk about that here today. And Deborah is both an author. She's been a leading advocate on oceans and fisheries for years here, and an advocate on climate change. So please join me in welcoming Deborah. I'm going to sit down and just pin that on.
Really?
It's not looking like this shutdown statue. Accessible. So
here.
There we go.
Okay.
Yeah, you good.
Put this down a little. Okay. Thank you so much, Tim, for inviting me to join all of you this afternoon. It's been a pleasure when I've actually been in town to be able to be at the meetings with Dick and listen to all of the great ideas that are coming forward for Gloucester, and I'm hoping that all of you will find a way to participate and contribute. The Buddhist leader Thich Nhat Hanh said that the bells of mindfulness are ringing, calling us to consider how the way we live touches the earth. The way we live touches the earth. I wrote a whole book about how we need the sea that's all around us, how it provides the air we breathe and affects our climate. But today I'm going to talk a little bit about how we, in turn, are affecting that natural resource, both in the sea and a little bit on the edge of the shore. Now, as somebody just mentioned, in the past decade, the Gulf of Maine has warmed. It's warming in the last decade 99% faster than any body of salt water in the world. Is that better? Okay. That would be, if you calculated it out, 5 degrees Fahrenheit. That is a really big increase in water temperature. And you guys know all this. When I moved here 30 years ago, you'd walk out into the water and you'd be numb within 5 seconds of stepping ankle deep in the water. And now we can all swim laps along the length of Wingersheek Beach and Good Harbor and be in there for 30, 40 minutes at a time, and it doesn't really affect you very much. The warm water is affecting the ecology in the Gulf of Maine. Warm water fish are coming in. Here's the first one that's arriving, scup. Black sea bass. I don't have a slide of lobster. You all know what, go back one. You all know what lobster look like. The waters are getting too warm for lobster in Long Island Sound. They're getting diseased, but they're booming up here. So we have a big lobster fishery. The other one, green crab. There's a lot of discussion now about should we be eating the enemy. Green crab are multiplying prodigiously as the water is warming, devouring clams, blue mussels, and seagrass beds, including all the seagrass beds that we're trying to replant out in Essex Bay. I have a jar of frozen green crab broth in my freezer. A friend who's working with Legal Seafoods to try to find some culinary use that is acceptable to everybody for green crab. I think it's going to be taking him a long time. But these guys, this is Chesapeake Bay blue crab. This is starting to show up in the marsh behind my house and in the marshes in back of Plum Island Sound. This is really going to change the shellfish fishery up here. However, the Gulf of Maine is vulnerable to increasing acidity as carbon dioxide emissions increase. Carbon dioxide in the ocean has already increased 30%. And while the effects are more normally seen in cold water, there are situations around here which amplify it and make this area at risk. The first is that there are 60 freshwater rivers pouring into the Gulf of Maine. The freshwater is slightly more acidic, and that's increasing the acidity of the sea around the mouths of these rivers. Secondly, we've had increased intensity of storms. You saw that on Dick's slide. Consequence of a warmer atmosphere holding more water. You've seen all this. We get these incredible downpours within an hour. This is also delivering surges of fresh water, which are increasing the sea's acidity. Now, one of the consequences of an increasingly corrosive ocean is that it's the growth of oysters, clams, and mussels. There's millions of dollars worth of shellfish at stake here all along the New England coast. As our groundfish decline, we are increasing the farming of mussels and oysters. At the same time, we are projecting millions of dollars worth of losses in these industries in the coming decades. So that's ocean acidification. The second problem or issue with global warming in the waters around here would be the rising sea level. And you're going to hear a lot more about this when I'm done. I would just suggest that if you want to look at something really depressing, you go to Climate Central, where Ben Strauss has put together a whole bunch of new maps, and you can look at what will be happening to the parking lot and every place where we are right now by 2050. The thing about sea level rise is that you think that it's all in the future, and it's kind of abstract, but like the ocean acidification, it's beginning now, and it just happens in these small increments that you don't necessarily notice. When I first moved to Gloucester, I stood at the corner of Concord and Sumner Street with a man who'd been born on Concord Street and had been living there for 70 years. I had just moved in. The two of us were at the corner in waders with water pouring into our waders. It was up over our knees. We were standing there during a hurricane, and the road was flooded and the Sumner Street Bridge was flooded. He has since died. That was the only time in his life he'd ever seen that. I've now seen it multiple times since then. And that is the beginning of what happens when you have rising sea levels on top of a high tide with a storm surge. Now, most of what I'm going to be talking about are ecosystem effects of climate change, but I just wanted to say, while we have this picture of the salt marsh out here, that as we talk about Gloucester becoming carbon neutral, we have an amazing carbon sink right here, and that is our salt marshes. They both work as buffers against storm surges, but they're also amazing carbon sinks. And what we need to do is start working with our Conservation Commission to make sure that we are not building near these salt marshes and that we are allowing them the option of retreating inland so they can reseed as the water is rising. The salt marshes are also really important because they are home to 30% of the commercially valuable fish and shellfish that are part of Gloucester's economy. And on a calm day when the water is high, you can see that. You can see flounder skimming along the bottom. You can see clammers out on the clam flats. And I don't know about you, but many times at low tide, I've grounded my boat on the thick mussel beds that are out there. That fertility is there because of our salt marshes. In addition, the marshes shelter migrating birds, some of which are on the threatened and endangered species list, all of them beautiful, all of them coming through. I just want to show you a couple of them. This is the gray egret, the least tern, which nests on Crane's Beach, and the sanderling, which I'm sure you've seen scurrying by the waves when you're out on the beach. Now, the lives of all of these birds are jeopardized by a warming Earth. 90% of all shorebirds faced an increased risk of extinction because of global warming. And today, I thought, as you're thinking about what you might be doing to slow this, I would talk about one bird. This is the red knot. It has the distinction, it comes through Essex Bay. You can see it in the spring, more often in the fall. But I'm talking about it because it has the distinction of being the first U.S. bird listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, which was earlier this year, because its future is imperiled by global warming. If we don't deal with global warming, this bird will face extinction in the coming decades. The threats are losing the marshes where the birds roost, the beaches where they feed, and the increasingly acidic water, which jeopardizes the food that they eat. Now, I wrote a book about this plucky little bird called The Narrow Edge. The book deliberately acknowledges and describes, but does not dwell on the prospect of losing so much wildlife. I think it would have just broken my heart to write an entire book like that. Instead, it evokes the Pope Francis's call to, quote, recognize that we are profoundly united with those with whom we share this earth, a call he made in the hopes that we would channel this recognition into our own personal action. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about this amazing bird. It migrates 19,000 miles every year, practically from one end of the earth to the other. The journey begins here in Tierra del Fuego along the Strait of Magellan, where the birds winter on this isolated beach. This is a woman who is the dean of a prestigious university in Santiago, Chile, but where she spends most of her time following the birds in and out with this tide, which is a 7-mile tidal reach, trying to determine why their numbers have been dropping so precipitously. And she's been doing this for quite a while, but the problem is that the reason that these numbers may be dropping may have nothing to do with anything that Chileans are doing on the Strait of Magellan, and everything to do with what the rest of us are doing as we continue to emit fossil fuels. And ocean acidification finds its place on the Strait of Magellan, and the shellfish that the birds are eating are growing smaller and smaller. After the birds leave Tierra del Fuego, they move north to Argentina, where this woman is working. And she's in the slide today because she is living the message from the Pope's encyclical long before he wrote it. She invites people to consider this sign that she placed on a mud flat that says in Spanish, "We are all shorebirds," explicitly stating our profound connection to life at the edge of the sea. The journey of these I've come to think now like a ladder going up to the Arctic, where every rung is necessary and additional broken ones can jeopardize the whole trip. Those birds don't get enough to eat in Tierra del Fuego. They're not going to make it all the way to the Arctic. Here is a map that shows the migration route of just one bird that had a geolocator on it, and you can see, you don't have to study this map really carefully, but you can see that on one leg of the trip, it flew 3,000 miles south in 8 days, 5,000 miles north in 6 days. This would be going from the Brazil-Peru border all the way to the Outer Banks of North Carolina. And the important part of this is that these flights are all non-stop flights. So in order to make it that distance, you really need to be able to gain a lot of weight. At each of these stopovers, these birds are doubling their weight so they can stay in the sky that long. So it's really important that they have enough to eat and that they be undisturbed on the beach. Now, aside from the enormous physical stamina that's required to make these long navigations, how do they know where they're going and how do they get there? That's something that scientists don't fully understand. However, what they do know is that for all shorebirds, they understand weather systems moving across entire ocean basins. They have to in order to make these big trips. And the way one researcher described it to me, he said shorebirds always know where they are relative to where they're going. And then he looked at me and he said, that same question could be asked of us with far less certain an answer. But I would like to think that here today, where we have many opportunities being presented to us to act in ways that could keep all these birds flying, perhaps we are coming to know where we are relative to where we're going. Now, I went many, many places on this trip. I can't describe all of them really quickly in 20 minutes, but I did want to show you this slide. I went to this beach. Now, this beach looks like our beaches, but it's at the mouth of the Altamaha River in Georgia, where there aren't any dams or diversions and where the river flows unimpeded to the sea. Sand that is rebuilding the shoals and islands at its mouth as the water rises, and where conservation easements all along the side of the estuary are going to enable the marsh to retreat. This is a place of hope and possibility and a model for us as we think about what we might do. I stood on a beach watching these birds on a strip of sand that had grown 200 feet wider in just 5 years. Now, the whole purpose of this big migration is to go to nest in one of the most inhospitable places on the planet. This is Southampton Island, just south of the Arctic Circle. It looks pretty drear there. And it's a very beautiful place, but it is drear and it is difficult. And what I wanted to say about this place was that when we finally got to these luxurious accommodations, we had been grounded for days to the east in Iqaluit because the pilots were unable to bring the plane just right to this side of that tent because there was a raging snowstorm. When we got there, we got out of the plane, we started walking around, and we found a red knot that had a flag on it that had been in Delaware when I left Delaware, flew all the way up here, beat me up there, having flown through this raging hurricane. To me, while I was sitting in Iqaluit laden with hundreds of dollars worth of warm clothing and unable to go anywhere, to me, this kind of flight is the very definition of endurance, and resilience. Next one. So we were living up here for more than 3.5 weeks in the stark beauty of the Arctic. And I just wanted to point out this shotgun over there. We had to carry those everywhere we went. We slept with them, we ate with them, we walked with them, we took them to the outhouse. And the reason was this. This is a polar bear print that 10 years ago you would never ever have seen up on the ridge where we were living. The reason for that they were up there was this. The melting sea ice is changing the face of the Arctic. It's really hard for polar bears. I'm not going to go into all of that now. I'm sure you're all aware of that. But what I did want to suggest is that as the water is warming, the tree line is advancing. So that barren ridge that you saw where our tent was, if carbon emissions continue unabated, the tree line is going to be moving up onto that ridge. The predators are going to be moving up, and these birds are going to be pushed further and further north to find nesting areas. And the thing is, they can't go much further north. They're going to end up right at the edge of the Arctic Ocean, and they won't have a home anymore. So right now, spring does come on this dreary place, and this is the knot nesting. This is one of its companions. I just wanted to show you this. This is the ruddy turnstone. The knot knot, to me, is the bellwether for millions of other shorebirds, and this is just one of them. But the knot's fate is going to be the fate of 50 million North American shorebirds and many others across the world. The turnstone's numbers are declining just as rapidly as the knots. They're just not getting any publicity for it. These are the knot eggs. They don't always hatch, but when they do, the parents leave and the birds are on their own. And they start flying south over another indecipherable landscape. This is the Canadian muskeg, where I can't remember what the percentage is, but it's really, really high of the world's carbon is stored here in peat. And as this permafrost melts, there's going to be an acceleration of warming. The birds fly over this to James Bay, and then they also sometimes go here to the Mingan Islands in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And both of these places are threatened right now by increasing acidity, and the Mingan Islands are very low islands and will probably be disappearing as the water rises. At both of these places, the birds are eating shellfish. At James Bay, the acidity is so high now that the shellfish are starting to disappear. So I would like to leave you with this picture. This is a baby red knot, seen here in Gloucester at Halibut Point. It's young. This is in the late fall, early winter. This bird was young. It was born the summer before, and you can tell that its plumage is still quite fresh, and you can see it shining in this photo. Beating heart, she said, is to feel the heartbeat of the earth. As you go to all of these exhibits and you think about everything that is being presented to you in all these talks about the kinds of possibilities that are open to us, and whether you're going to think about putting solar panels on your house or adding more insulation or switching to green electricity or buying a smaller car with better mileage, or given what Dick just said to me about having done all that, what I'm going to do next, perhaps you may, as you're trying to make these decisions, think about this bird and all of its companions that need us now. This bird in whose heart beats the heart of our earth, an earth that we all share. Thanks. Okay. Did I do it fast enough? It's really hard condensing 4 years worth of work into 20 minutes. Are there any questions? Yes.
Looking forward to reading your book. I was wondering if you had any specific things to say about the decline in horseshoe crabs based on overharvesting.
He asked me if I had anything to say about the decline in horseshoe crabs due to overharvesting. And I actually have lots to say about that, but didn't say it today because the horseshoe crab is one of Earth's oldest animals. The oldest fossil of a horseshoe crab that we know about now is 475 million years old. This means that when the next mass extinction, if it comes to pass, if we're not able to control our carbon emissions, we're all going to go, but this animal is going to stay. It's really good at adapting to an ocean that's rich in carbon dioxide. But your question had to do with overharvesting. In Delaware Bay, this bird is completely dependent on eating the eggs of the horseshoe crab. We fished it out in Delaware Bay to use as bait. This is unconscionable, and we're doing that up here in Massachusetts. The horseshoe population in New England is being taken at such a high rate, it is no longer sustainable. And just to answer the question really briefly, we've had 15 years of regulation for this, and that is unacceptable, and we need to have a coastwide moratorium on the taking of horseshoe crab for bait, and we need a much more stringent regulation of the biomedical industry. It's an aside. Maine and the fishing. None of the fish that I showed you at the beginning are going to be able to replace, in terms of their economic value, the cod and haddock that we have up here. We have had, historically, the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank have been one of the most productive, fertile fisheries in the world. And losing that to scup and black sea bass, those fish are pretty good to eat. It's just not going to be the same. Now, I will argue that overfishing and inadequate regulation of our cod and haddock industry caused this stock to collapse. What has happened, though, as the water warms with a collapsed stock, is less resilient and unable to deal with it. So the fisheries managers are saying that instead of whatever timeline they had thought it might take to restore this, it's going to take another 8 to 10 years on top of that. And while all this bad news was being delivered from here, I would like to call your attention to what was happening on the Grand Banks and Newfoundland in Canada. In the 1990s, the same thing happened there. Their cod fishery was entirely fished out due to inadequate regulation and overfishing. The Canadian government, though, did something that we have not done. The Canadian government shut down the entire Grand Banks and Newfoundland codfish industries. It put 44,000 people out of work overnight. It compensated those people, but I'm sure the compensation did not substitute for a way of life that was lost. In addition, they put very stringent limits on the catch of the bait. In this case, it was capelin, which is what the cod and the haddock were eating up there. And I was in Newfoundland when that happened. It was really, really horribly sad. I was in a small fishing village where they had brought in the last of the cod that they could take, and these cod were just so tiny because all the big ones were gone. And I never ever thought, and I talked to all the fisheries biologists up at Dalhousie, and we just thought this is the end of this grand, great thing. All this bad news was being delivered here about the Gulf of Maine last week. A number of papers were released showing that this cod fishery up there is rebounding now after a 20-year moratorium at a rate which is just phenomenally high. And they benefited from warm water, but they're going to keep this fishery closed until it recovers because everybody is so excited to see that a sea that can be fished out could actually come back. And I think that's important for us to think about too.